A few days ago, we lost a legal Second Amendment giant that you may not have ever heard about because he's critically important to the United States Supreme Court and the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms and how it was protected by Justice Scalia in the Heller case. Stay tuned. I want to talk to you about Larry Silberman, the late judge from the D.C. Court of Appeals, and why he's so important to your right to keep and bear arms today. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and best-selling author. If you have not subscribed to the Four Boxes Diner Second Amendment channel, please do so and show your love for the right to keep and bear arms. I was recently down in Texas speaking to the Second Amendment Foundation's annual conference dealing with gun rights. And I had numerous conversations. One of the points that I wanted to, and I did make over and over and over again, was the fact that all people in the Second Amendment movement have a different role to play. We don't all play the same role. Some of us teach people how to shoot guns. Some of us teach people about the Second Amendment. Some of us teach people about history. Some people do politics. Some people do lobbying. The point is that it takes all sorts of people with all sorts of skill sets to help protect the American Constitution, including the Second Amendment. So I want to talk about the passage of Larry Silberman, who was a longtime federal judge on the D.C. Court of Appeals. He was also a law professor of mine at NYU Law School many, many years ago when I was a young student there. Larry Silberman died at the age of 86. He is mission critically important to the Second Amendment for many reasons. The most important of which is that Larry Silberman wrote, at the time, really the definitive judicial account of why the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms. Larry Silberman on the D.C. Circuit wrote that opinion in the year 2007. The name of that case was Parker versus the District of Columbia. When that case was taken just months later up to the United States Supreme Court, the name of that case was changed from Parker versus the United States, and it became HELLER versus D.C., which gave rise, of course, to HELLER, the famous 2008 decision written by Justice Scalia. But Justice Scalia, when he wrote that HELLER decision, was not writing on a blank slate. In fact, if you compare Judge Silberman's decision in the Court of Appeals, the court one step below the Supreme Court, if you look at the Parker decision, which I'll put a link to it in the description of this video, you'll see that Judge Silberman explains in great textual detail, as well as historical detail, the origins and the meaning of the right to keep and bear arms in America, and why it is a fundamental individual right here in the United States and in the Constitution. And the Justice Scalia opinion in the Heller case for the U.S. Supreme Court tracks many of the same arguments and observations in history that Judge Larry Silberman made in the Parker case. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some other contributions that Judge Silberman made, in addition to that critically important decision in Parker, which gave rise to Heller. Because remember, we talked about the law working incrementally. I want to step back just briefly. We often talk about the process of the law in America, that lower courts decide things in your favor, then appellate courts rely on those, then the Supreme Court looks at that, and you have really incremental, right? Judge Silberman is also important for his role on who became Supreme Court justices and other critical advocates to the Second Amendment. For example, Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett today clerked for Judge Silberman, and Judge Silberman gave her much training in the Second Amendment and other issues because that's how judges work with young law clerks. It's very prestigious for a young law student right out of law school, or I should say a young lawyer right out of law school, to get a federal clerkship with any federal judge in the United States. It's very prestigious, very hard to get. And Amy Coney Barrett got a clerkship with Judge Silberman. And a year later, Judge Silberman recommended her to become a clerk for the United States Supreme Court. And Amy Coney Barrett went to clerk for Justice Scalia, got further training. And now, of course, Amy Coney Barrett supported the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms in the recent NYSERDA versus Bruin case. So that was very good news. Beyond that, we know that one of the top advocates in support of the Second Amendment before the Supreme Court is Paul Clement. You've often heard that name. Paul Clement clerked also for Judge Silberman as well when he was a young lawyer. So you can see how certain judges and justices are mission critical for training young minds to help them ultimately succeed in the legal profession. And certainly Paul Clement, with his major win in Nyserpa versus Bruin, and so on and so on. He's won many cases before the Supreme Court on the Second Amendment. And combined with him and Amy Coney Barrett, obviously Judge Silberman had great influence on the Second Amendment, not just with writing the Parker decision, which was really the lower court decision of Heller, and also with his role in helping to shape the minds of Paul Clement and Amy Coney Barrett. And although he was my law professor as well, and I really enjoyed my experience with him, and I think we got along quite well. On this channel here at the Four Boxes Down, I try to give you some of the details about the inner workings about the Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms, as well as the entire Constitution, how it works at the highest levels of American society, how it works at the Supreme Court. Because I want to give you this information because I don't think you can really find it in any other place out there on YouTube or otherwise. So I try to give you the stuff that you're not going to get anywhere else but here at the Four Boxes Diner. And that is an interesting twist of historical fate that helped give rise to Heller, which was a huge win for our side. Specifically, Judge Silberman, before he became a judge, was nominated to a position in the Department of Justice. Now, this was done in the 1970s when Judge Silberman at the time was not a judge. He was a very young lawyer. And during the colloquy, meaning the discussion, the Q&A that went on when he was before the United States Senate for his confirmation process, because he had to be confirmed by the Senate for this job with the Department of Justice, the late Senator Ted Kennedy asked him a series of questions, specifically, will you help work with us to craft legislation involving Saturday night specials? Now, for those of you who don't remember this, Saturday night specials were a gun in the 1970s that were considered useful only to criminals. We don't need to get into the details about Saturday night specials, but it was a hot political topic, and people like Ted Kennedy wanted to ban all guns, but they certainly wanted to try to ban Saturday night specials. Now, this is a fateful answer. Judge Silberman, at the time, who was just a lawyer, when Ted Kennedy asked him, will you help us work to craft legislation that bans Saturday night specials? Judge Silberman, then lawyer Silberman, just simply said, well, yeah, if you can define it, we can, basically, if you can define it, we can help craft legislation. Now, Judge Silberman will tell you that he was quite familiar with guns. He was a hunter. He owned guns, was a gun guy, and basically thought Kennedy's question was dumb and was kind of spoofing Kennedy a little bit when he said, if you can define it, we can talk about banning it. But what's interesting, and this is the critical twist of fate, and I'll put the story that actually from Silberman's own words, I'll put his speech to an event at the NRA Civil Rights Defense Fund back in the early aughts, basically, I think it was 2012, he gave the speech, and I'll put the speech down below. Judge Silberman said that he found out later that kind of snarky comment he made in the Senate confirmation hearings in the 1970s to Ted Kennedy was actually a reason why in 1987, when Larry Silberman was a D.C. Court of Appeals judge, and his name got brought out as a potential Supreme Court justice for President Ronald Reagan to nominate him to the Supreme Court, it turns out, according to Larry Silberman's speech that he gave in 2012, that the NRA opposed, this is interesting, the NRA opposed the nomination of Larry Silberman to the United States Supreme Court in 1987. So Larry Silberman did not get a nomination and did not become a member of the United States Supreme Court in 1987. Now, in one sense, that's kind of sad and bad news because Larry Silberman was a great pro-Second Amendment guy and would have been great on the Supreme Court. On the other hand, it could be the most important and best decision that the NRA ever made, because by keeping Larry Silberman off the Supreme Court, because they feared his position on the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, by keeping him off the Supreme Court in 1987, it allowed Judge Silberman to stay on the D.C. Court of Appeals. And of course, in 2007, because Judge Silberman was still on the Court of Appeals and not at the Supreme Court, Judge Silberman wrote in 2007 the Parker versus D.C. case, which, as you know, literally 12 months after that case became Heller. So if Silberman had not written that decision in support of the Second Amendment, this very powerful decision that ruled in favor of the Second Amendment on the D.C. Circuit. One wonders whether or not that case ever would have made it to the U.S. Supreme Court, and we might still be here waiting to see for our next Heller case, which may or may not have ever come. So strangely enough, the NRA's opposition to Judge Silberman in 1987 for not being elevated to the Supreme Court, they said, don't go to the Supreme Court, we don't trust him, turns out may have been the best decision the NRA ever made in terms of protecting our right to keep and bear arms. But it's very interesting how these twists and turns in politics in D.C. can make such a dramatic change, good and bad, for our right to keep and bear arms. And the last point I want to make about Larry Silberman is after the Heller decision was decided saying we had an individual right to keep and bear arms, which was decided in 2008, several judges, including so-called originalist judges, who usually originalist judges are good for us because originalism means we go back to the 1791 and try to understand what the founding fathers meant by a particular provision of the Bill of Rights or the Constitution, and we apply it that way, and we try to be loyal that way and faithful that way to that understanding. We don't try to have the Constitution live and we make new stuff up, and today we try to be faithful to what the founders intended. Because that's how it works in the law. You try to figure out what the contract meant and apply it as the people who drafted the contract intended. That's the goal, to get this stuff right when you're dealing with older and ancient documents. Now, what's interesting is that Larry Silberman took to task a Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals judge named Richard Posner. So after the Heller decision was decided, Richard Posner, who was a Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals judge known for law and economics, wrote kind of a nasty negative attack on the Heller decision and explained it was not rational. It wasn't right, that the right to keep and bear arms protected a collective right or a militia right, and explained why. And one of the interesting things is Posner explained back right after Heller was decided that the idea that you could use modern firearms to thwart superpowers and powerful armies and all that is just an absurd proposition. But after Richard Posner published this article attacking the proposition that small arms, such as what you own and what I own, can somehow thwart a superpower or can stave off a tyrannical army, Judge Silberman kind of guffawed and says that's simply not true. And here's what Judge Larry Silberman wrote. He says, Posner said these sorts of guns, small guns, private guns, are not very useful in modern war. It should be obvious on its face that this is not an originalist argument because the framers were not aware of modern weapons. So after Judge Larry Silberman read Richard Posner's negative attacks on the Heller decision in the New Republic magazine, I'll put the links to this down below, this is what Larry Silberman said his impression was of the Posner article. He says that Posner made an argument that these sort of regular guns used for self-defense and hunting were not effective against modern militaries. Well, Judge Silberman completely disagreed with that. This is what he wrote. Posner was wrong as a matter of military experience. In the last 60 years, going back to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, we have seen many examples of people's militia fighting off modern weapons with only pistols, rifles, and shotguns. Close quote. That is a quote from Larry Silberman, D.C. Court of Appeals judge, in response to someone claiming that the right to keep and bear arms was a collective right and not an individual right. So to summarize, Larry Silberman, D.C. Court of Appeals, passed away a few days ago at the age of 86 years of age. He was my former law professor, a great man. He was the mentor to Paul Clement, a great Second Amendment advocate. He was a mentor and boss to Amy Coney Barrett, who's now in the United States Supreme Court. Larry Silberman was a giant in the Second Amendment. His powerful opinion in Parker versus D.C. in 2007, which was the precursor to Heller versus D.C., which we all know and love. So, our condolences go out to Larry Silberman's family and to his former colleagues and friends. And again, I hope you learned a little bit something here at the Four Boxes Diner. If you haven't subscribed, please do so, and we'll see you again soon at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.